You're listening to Science and Saucery, a show dedicated to adding life to your years. And now your hosts, registered dietitian Juliana Hever and scientist Ray Cronice.
Welcome.
Hello, hello.
How are you doing this morning?
I'm great, Raymond James. How are you doing?
I am doing phenomenal. It was so much fun to do our Q&A episodes.
Yes.
So we're going to get back to interviews today, but I guess people like hearing us just have conversations, which that's not all bad.
No, I like it.
It does still feel kind of weird when we're just talking about stuff.
It feels very vulnerable, but a lot of people kind of reached out and noticed that and kind of gave us all this love and support. So it was good.
Yeah, and I think maybe soon we can do a live one at some point. We're ready to do all that with video, so we may figure out how to coordinate and get a lot of people online and do a live one all at once. I guess, the first one, you sort of haven't built up those anticipations, and so you don't want crickets. But on the other hand, I don't know if you want to be overwhelmed either.
I know. So, it's a fine line.
I can't believe my daughter does that every single day.
I know, and she does it so well.
She was visiting with us yesterday, and it was just so interesting to just hear her deal with all of the trolls in the audience and all the things that you just have to let go by.
Mm-hmm.
And, you want to address them all, but it just
can't.
never works. You got to starve them of oxygen the way Tim Ferriss always used to say.
I do that. You're the one that love it.
I like trolling trolls. It doesn't bother me. So I think a lot of people are afraid they're going to look bad. But I think by now, if you don't realize that someone's being a troll, and if you don't realize that the person who they're trolling is trolling them back, then I think you're kind of missing a whole part of the internet. I'm
fine with missing that part of the internet.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm just saying I'm not worried about what people think when I'm trolling someone back. I'm okay with that.
I know you are. We have various opinions on that that kind of differ.
But
that's okay.
That segues into our interview today.
Indeed. With
Dave Lakhani, who I've known for probably about 15 years. And he's an expert in Persuasion. He has a couple books on persuasion and a lot of books on getting things done. I wrote a chapter for a book that he has out back in 2009. I wrote that, which was the book is How to Sell When Nobody's Buying. And I wrote a chapter on disruptive excellence with him. So it was kind of fun to do that.
That's a very cool name, disruptive excellence. Yeah. Very interesting, provocative concept.
Yeah, it's a combination of that idea of disruptive business practices, but using those or focusing those on making things excellent. And I think a lot of what we're doing together now is sort of a great fallout of that, because both of us could take the well-worn path and make probably tons of money with some gimmick weight loss thing. And that's not what we're doing. We're actually permanently transforming people's lives. We spend that time. It's not the get rich fast plan. And
no, we've said no to everything that doesn't stick in alignment with what we want to say.
And it feels so good to wake up every day and know that, that's not to say that you don't make mistakes, and it's not to say that your opinion doesn't change over time. But what is important is in standing for something. Now, there'll be those business only minded people that come around and say, well, yeah, stand for only and go broke. But I think that's a false choice. I think you actually can really be dedicated to what you're doing. And when I met you, that was one of the big differences. Like, you really cared about people. You really cared about your clients. You really cared if someone wasn't getting results. You would call me in those early days and say, I just don't understand.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, that's like our prime directive, is making the results and making everyone have success. That's what we want to do.
Yeah.
Nothing else matters.
And that's important. So what's really great about Dave, and we'll bring him on in a second, but what's really great about Dave is that he's spoken to people around the world, and he has a really interesting background that I hope we get into today. But it's really interesting to look at the world through his lens, and because he's worked with all kinds of people, from governments to some of those businesses that we just talked about that just want to propel people into success. And all of them share in common the idea to move people forward and to move people towards something, whatever that something is. And he performs when it comes to those things. So I want to bring on Dave Lakhani. So welcome, Dave. Welcome to this episode of Science and Saucery.
Thanks very much for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, we're both looking forward to talking to you about this because we're involved in change every day. And I think it's going to be fun, especially because Juliana doesn't know as much about your background. I think it's going to be fun for us all to have this sort of fluid conversation about this. I think our audience is really going to love it.
I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be very exciting. I love talking about change and our resistance to it.
Yeah. So let's start with a little bit of background. You and I have known each other for about 15 years, but what I know about you is you had this really tumultuous path growing up. Can you tell our audience a little bit about, because it's kind of unreal to hear this story about how you ended up as this best-selling author and this change agent, because I don't think they would ever guess where you got your start.
Right. So I'm best known as an author and speaker and trainer and consultant in the area of persuasion, human influence, mass influence. And so I got that start, though, in an odd way. I was raised in a religious cult from the time I was 6 until I was 16 years old. I was raised in a cult called Branhamites. They believed in an end-time prophet named William Branham. They believed he was the literal resurrection of the prophet Elijah from the Bible. And they believed in no education past 6th or 7th grade. They believed that women needed to be subservient to their husbands or to men. And if they were not subservient to their husbands, corporal punishment was allowed. If you were a woman, there was no cutting your hair, wearing makeup, or any garment that pertained to a man. If you were a man, there was no long hair. Obviously, smoking, drinking, all of those things completely restricted. No television, no music that was not gospel music. And you went to church, on Tuesdays, Thursdays, twice on Sundays, sometimes Fridays. Some of my most vivid memories are of like New Year's Eve. You would go to church at 6, 7 in the afternoon, and you would then pray literally on your knees until midnight that God would let the earth continue into the new year. Now, when you're 6 or 7 years old, you just do it. I was literally, I remember having this distinct reaction when it occurred to me sometime in my teen years, like, hold on a minute here. Like, the world is not falling off in time zones. This already happened someplace. And that was one of the things that sort of created a big fracture for me. Like, this is, a lot of these things are not true. And so, I really saw the cracks first when I was probably 11 years old. But, when you're 11, you just double down because there's nothing else to do. But when I was 16 years old, I'd had a lot of issues. My brother had ADHD, which meant he was literally possessed by the devil. It's a particularly fascinating and powerful devil because he's also still attached to my brother and some of his children. And so the best way to get devils out, according to these people, were to beat them out of you. And by the time I was 16 years old, I was getting into physical altercations with deacons and people like that because I was not going to have them beating my brother senseless for no good reason. And that was really the final kind of straw for me. And I realized at that point, one of two things had to happen. I either needed to double down and completely comply, and by that time, that was not an option for me, or I had to leave, literally leave my home. And so I made it my decision. That's what I was going to do. I talked to my mom. She said that I had to go back to the church, talk to the pastors and all of those people, and do whatever they said in terms of leaving. So when I was 16, I did that. I went to church one last time, stood up on the pulpit, and was laid hands on and prayed that God would turn my soul over to Satan for the destruction of my flesh, so I would be killed for my transgressions. And I was excommunicated from the church and excommunicated from my family. I was no longer allowed to talk to any of my family members or anybody that I'd grown up in the church with. And so we had moved actually to Idaho to start one of these churches. My mom and my stepdad at the time had moved here. And we moved here when I was about 7 years old. And so that was really my fundamental basis for my infrastructure and, my friends group and all of those kinds of things. So I really had no one in a significant way. I didn't have a social group. I didn't have a support group, those kind of things. So I left and I went, it was interesting because the one thing that they never said you couldn't do was go to the library. And so my mom would take us to the Carnegie Public Library. And if you remember these Carnegie libraries, these were these old palatial brick buildings and really cool stone buildings. And Mom would take us there on Saturdays, and she would let us check out as many books on anything that we wanted to. And she never really paid that close of attention. So I would check out 20 or 30 books at a time. And I would take them home and I would read them and, go through them all and learn things. And that's how I taught myself beyond school. I mean, one of the things I refused to do was ever leave school. And so one of the other things I discovered early on is that cults don't particularly like a lot of scrutiny. So anytime that they would tell me that it was time for me to leave school, they were just, they were rolling the dice and banking. Like, you tell a 13-year-old boy, hey, look, you don't have to go back to school. It's like jackpot, done. Right.
And they don't realize that's this limitation. In fact, one of my really good friends from college, Val Byler, came to University of Alabama in Huntsville and ultimately to NASA. I think he's still a physicist there after getting out of the Amish community. And we spent so many hours because he was very recently out of that, as his mind was unwrapping all the things that he was taught about the universe and the world around him, but more importantly, all the things that he came up with his own sort of solutions. Like, in the absence of that knowledge that you're talking about, our brains want to synthesize some explanation. So sometimes it can be, the results of other people's thinking, dogma, right? But other times it can be something like, he had this whole plan where there was this outer shell around the world, and that the sun was there, but there were holes on one side, and that's what stars were. And he really came to believe all of this. They had their car parked in the field that they could go out and drive some because they weren't allowed to have that, So there are all these coping mechanisms that the curiosity in a child, we have these most curious years, and they sort of, literally, I guess, beat the curiosity out of you guys.
They do. And they really require strict adherence to these ideals. And because my mom got divorced, that meant that she wasn't capable of making any decisions on her own, really, without the assistance of a man. So that meant deacons until I was about 13 years old. When I was 13 years old, I took over the position in the home of the man, and my mom had to listen to me and do what I said. And it's a great gig if you can get it when you're 13, but it's not very appropriate. And so when I left, I went to, so there's a couple of interesting things about the library, and this is really a pivotal point for me. One, they didn't mind that you read, and they really encouraged things like Westerns and things like that. So I became a really big fan of Louis L'Amour, and I read all of his books and Zane Grey's books. And the really fascinating part about that is both of those authors explored really big ideas. Louis L'Amour was constantly quoting Plato, for example, and really exploring the whole idea of Plato's cave in some of his books and those kind of things, right? And so those expanded my mind in ways they couldn't have possibly imagined, and made me curious about things that they couldn't possibly imagine, which led me to deeper and deeper exploration at the library on a very regular basis. And so when I left home, I left that day, and I did the only thing I could do. I packed everything that I owned into the back of a 1970 Ford Falcon. It filled up half of the back seat, and I drove away from home knowing that I didn't know what I was going to do.
Yeah, I mean, you're stepping out into this world that you've been in this dome of ideology, and like, how do you even know where to begin? You're so young.
Yeah, it's a great question, Juliana, because I really didn't know where to begin, but I did know how to survive. So when we had moved to Idaho, we literally lived in a tent in a park for 3 months. And, we ate out of dumpsters behind Albertsons. Back then, they would put the old vegetables and bread and things like that. They would just stack it up out behind the store, and people would come and get it who needed food. And, that's what we ate. I mean, like, you pull the mold off the bread, you strain the chunks out of the milk, and that's how you live. And so I knew that I wouldn't die, right? And this is Idaho. I could hunt, I could fish, I could do whatever. Like, I wasn't worried about physical survival in a meaningful way. I could sleep in my car. I knew how to survive that way. But what I didn't know was how to survive everything else. And I was also at that point very angry, as you could maybe imagine.
Of course.
Yeah.
That my mom had let this happen and all of these things. And so I had to understand, like, how did my mom make this decision to raise me and my two younger brothers in this crazy religious organization, and how had they gotten a hold of her? Because my mom was not an uneducated woman. She'd gone to Berkeley, and she had, been a very, very smart woman. And it was a very smart woman, but she was very easily persuaded along these lines. And so fast forward, I go to the library, and I'm sitting there, and I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking, okay, I've got to figure this out. So I literally that day began studying persuasion, influence, the heuristics of decision making, the psychology of belief. And I really wanted to understand, like, how do people make these decisions? And that was my only real reference point, was start reading books. And so that's what I did. And I've continued doing that now for nearly 40 years. And the result has been that I've learned quite a lot about why people do what they do and why they make the decisions they make and all of those things. And I've also learned a lot about, what I'm still learning and what I don't know. And so that's the important part, I think, is to remain intensely curious. And I will say this because I know that this will go a lot of different directions as we move on from here. I'll say this very early on. I'm also keenly aware of my own biases, and I don't mind having them pointed out if I seem to be missing them. I have my own frameworks for seeing the world. I have my own mental models that work for me. And I'm not saying that anything I say is 100% true about anyone, because it's not. But there are a lot of things that people can learn and take away. And I'm a big fan of, the 20 or 30% of things that you need to know to get 90% of the results that you need. And then you can figure it out from there. And so that's the thing. And then I'm also still a giant autodidact. And I look forward to other people being the same way. And I suspect anybody listening to this podcast is very much a self-learner, and they're very well self-taught. Interestingly enough, all of that background, though, led me in odd directions. Like, it led me to punk rock. And people would have been like, what? Punk rock? Why? But the reality of it is punk rock has this DIY ethos, this sense of, like, separate but different, and,
rebellion. There's this, that is really bold of you to be able to step away like that with your family. I mean, just to walk away from all that you knew and everyone, and compared to what we always say, compared to what? Like, you didn't, what do you even know about the rest of the way everything else functions in the world?
Right. What did I even know about people? Like, my orientation around people was, when I was a young boy, 7, 8, 9 years old, was walking around town, walking up to women who, were, and it's pretty funny because you could split these women at about 40 years old, and I would walk up to them and I would say to them something like, if you were standing in front of me, I would say, you look like such a lovely woman. You're, so pretty, and you seem so kind and nice. You seem like you'd be a great mom or somebody's sister. I just, really appreciate that about you. But I just want you to know one thing. You're going to hell, Jezebel, with your horse makeup, your bobbed hair, your earrings, your pants, and like that causes a real disconnect. People,
wow.
Right? Yeah. And they just are like, what in the world is going on? And at about 40 years old, you could draw a line. Earlier than 40 years old, they just would be like, what are you saying? What's happened here? Where is your mother? And so I would take them to my mom, and, they got to meet mom, and mom was the closer. And so they would come over and talk to my mom, and, she would give some rational explanation about why I was that way and what I was doing. About 40 years or older, and remember, this is the 1970s, you would get a very hard slap in your face, and then somebody would grab you by your hair or ear and drag you to your mother. And same thing, they got to meet mom. She was the closer.
Right. And she would take that sort of good cop, bad cop sort of approach and twist it all the way around. When we talk about this in this bigger picture, both of you and I have studied Eric Hoffer's True Believer, and actually he was just brilliant in so many different ways in the simplicity. What can our audience learn about influence and his work? Because I know you're a big fan of his, or at least in terms of study this, and I just wonder, what can we learn to sort of get them in this mind space of how people are influenced?
Well, I think, yeah, it's a great question. So I think the really important thing to know about Eric Hoffer's work is really thinking about why people, especially why groups of people are moved, because his real focus was on mass movements. And I think one of the things that really appealed to me about Eric Hoffer was the whole idea that he was not a psychologist. He was not, somebody who was well educated. He was a longshoreman in the, I think I probably
in San Francisco.
Yeah, in San Francisco, like in the 50s or maybe even, the 40s. But it was well before well before anybody would really be thinking about these things in a meaningful way. He was thinking about them and looking at them. And he identified a lot of things that turned out to be actually very, very correct. And he was just a very good observer of the human condition. And I think that, one of the things that he pointed out and why people do this, so whether they decide to become vegan, vegetarian, whether they decide to become paleo, whether they decide to become keto, when we're talking about diets, it's that something, this fundamental spark was there. There was a desire for change. And that desire for change drives those mass movements. And when a lot of people feel the same, that same level of discontent around something, it's easy to then begin to present them with opportunities or ideas that they can, galvanize around. And you can also create strong polarization away from other things as well. And so, but most of these people feel like, the control is outside of themselves. They don't feel like they don't feel like they're in control of something. So oftentimes, and this is a wild generalization and I accept that, oftentimes people who are overweight think it's not their fault. They blame the food industry, or they blame, the way they were raised, or they blame their emotions, or they blame, all of these other things. And all of those things can also be true. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they've given up their sense of internal control to someone else or some other thing or some diet. And when it doesn't work, there's a convenient thing to blame that's not them.
Right.
And so that core idea that, is what appeals to people. So when, and when you see people getting these amazing results and having, wonderful things happen for them, it's very, very appealing to say, yeah, I want some of that too. So that's that appeal and that initial desire for change. And then, then it's really creating a language of their own, which is the next interesting part about this. And this is particularly true about dieting, and it's particularly true about food in general, is that there's lots of labels. And I don't mean food labels with nutritional information on them. I mean, like, for example, nobody says, I'm doing a generally calorically restricted eating plan that consists primarily of fat and that is derived from animal sources. And, they don't describe their diet that way. They say, oh, I'm doing keto.
Right.
I'm doing low
carnivore.
Carb.
Yep.
I'm a carnivore diet. I'm doing
vegan.
I'm vegan. Yeah, exactly. Vegans, it's easy to point, especially on something like this where you're heavily oriented around vegetarianism and veganism. It's very easy to point to everybody else and say that's it. But vegans are fanatics as well. Mm-hmm. And so, it's really, that's why we're seeing this change from vegan vegetarianism to plant-based and plant-forward and those kinds of ideas, right? So the second part of this that's really important is this whole idea of having labels and having names that people can give themselves. And there's always loss inside of that. And with diets, it's literally a loss of weight, but it's often also a loss of identity and a loss of sense of self and a loss of community and all of the things that I went through when I left the church. And when you talk about those things and you think about them, like a lot of the reasons that people fail at diets are all of those things, right? So they get this new label and this new identity, but sometimes they don't necessarily fully embrace it or engage it or accept it as who they are. And the result is they're not able to keep the label or keep the change because there's other more important labels and other more important things. But the point about it is when it works, when it really takes, it's because that not only was there some, was there some desire for change, there was also some loss that happened in there. Something happened. There was a sense of loss. It could have, like when we talk about massive social change and things like that, it's usually things like money, status, desirability, all of those kinds of things, right? But, when we talk about food, it's something totally different. It's usually a loss of, sense of self and, some sense of, who I used to be, people live in the past, those kind of things. And so that's the second part of it. And then when we really start talking about food as a movement, that's really the third part of the mass change using Hoffer's model. And that's when you start seeing who shows up and who are the leaders of this this idea. So it starts out with everybody starts to take action. There's a sense of self-sacrifice. Like that, if you look at dieting, especially, there's this whole idea of self-sacrifice. Like, I gave up carbs. I gave up meat. I gave up, like there's this orientation of what I lost. Oil, right? Whatever it is, right? I've lost these things. Like I've given them up, and they were a real and meaningful part of who I am, right? They bond together around the suffering, right?
It's so funny because I can't get past that idea of the loss, because to me it feels like this hope that comes over, and the reason for the execution of that change. And I mean, whenever someone asks me how to eat plant-based or whatever, I always starting with a positive attitude. Oh, what am I going to experiment with? What am I going to experience as new stuff, as opposed to what am I giving up? And don't you think that, like, at what point is it, there's so much positive or so much incentive to go in that direction that you're thinking about all the good stuff and the hope that's aligned with what you believe is going to happen by making these changes?
So yes and no is the long and short answer to that. So yes, there's like all of those positive things. Those are the kinds of things that will drive you forward and keep you hopefully motivated and moving in the right direction. And then you get reinforcing beliefs and behaviors and demonstrations of success that encourage you to continue. But the reality of it is moving people out of stasis and moving them out of their comfort zone is very hard. And any attempt to change, and when we talk about resistance, we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, but people don't resist change. They resist the need to change, or they resist the force to be changed. And so when people have developed over a lifetime, a sense of what is comfortable and what is safe and all of those things, right? Getting them to change those things and develop a new normal is very, very hard, even when the outcome is very positive, right? So when you think about these things, so let's use men's health as an example. So I heard a really good, hopefully we can be relatively open on this thing, and I can say things that are, some people may find a little more difficult, but if this
be
is
provocative, we love it.
Well, it's not being provocative, it's words, right.
but I mean, go ahead.
Yeah. So there was this idea that, your penis is the barometer of your health if you're a man, right? If your erections are firm and strong, you probably have a good cardiovascular system. Your, small veins are probably not blocked very much, because, some of your smallest veins in your vascularity throughout your body is in your penis. And so if they get blocked, right, then you start having ED and you don't have as firm of erections, or you don't get erections at all, which is
refer to episode 18. We have a whole interview about this.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great.
With one of the top urologists on ED.
Yep.
Right. Oh, okay, great. So, so that's great. So, but that whole idea is like, sex is one of those, strong driving ideals, right? The biological urge needs to propagate. And let's face it, I mean, like when you put it on a list of fun things, like sex is right up there, probably, one or two. And so when people start thinking about that, you'd think, okay, great. When you start seeing that happen, like making the changes that would be required to, do something about your vascularity would be really important. But the reality of it is that food is more comforting than sex, right? It gives you a similar sort of release, and it gives you a similar sort of pathway that you can do in public and be very, very satiated and feel good and all of those things. So changing that behavior, it's easier, because by the time that happens to most people, they're a little bit older. It rarely happens in your 20s or 30s. It more likely happens in your 50s, 60s, 70s. And by that time, you've developed such interesting behaviors around all the other things, and your biological urge to have sex has reduced, so you're not as interested. It becomes harder and harder to change those things that would make the most difference. And yet, the reality of it is nobody looks at that and says, this isn't about food or sex. It's actually about living. Like, it really is the survival mechanism, but you don't have a sense of being about to die. So to that end, Juliana, it's really difficult for people to make those kinds of decisions. And so there is a sense of loss to them. So if you've loved ho-hos your whole life, and now you can't eat ho-hos anymore, like for the rest of your life, right? And I know that's being extreme, because I know that you, Ray, particularly have an idea of, and I'm going to get this wrong, but rare and appropriate. Rare and appropriate, right? Thank you. And so it's the whole idea of rare and appropriate, right? It doesn't mean you can't ever have a ho-ho the rest of your life, right? Unless you have some reason that you shouldn't do it. Let's biological or,
right.
something other related like that, right? But rare and appropriate, right? Problem with it is that rare and appropriate is usually every day for a lot of people.
Yes.
And so it's that whole idea.
Frequent and inappropriate.
It becomes an F&I.
F&I.
The RNA turns into an F&I.
Yeah.
Right. And so the reality of it is that people do feel like they're giving something up, and they do feel like they're sacrificing, and they are, and it's not just sacrifice of food though. It's, it's the whole idea, when Ray and I first started talking about this 5 or 6 years ago now, 7 years ago, maybe, I said, okay, Ray, I'm going to take you up on your little plan here, and I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it through Thanksgiving and Christmas, because and New Year's, because those are the hardest possible combinations of people wanting you to eat, people forcing food on you, people, and also being like socially inappropriate by not participating in their gaiety and their offerings of food and all of those things. And I did it, and it was fine, but it was eye-opening to me too, like how offended other people are when you don't do those things.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes.
And so there are, they're not like overtly offended, like, you offend me, get out of my house, but they're hurt. And, they're hurt in many ways because they think you don't like their stuff. They think that you are, it's all about them, and it's nothing about you. Like, if you dropped over dead from a heart attack because you had their fried chicken, well, that's a perfectly reasonable outcome because my chicken is delicious, So it's very difficult that way. So people do feel like this real sense of giving things up, and around that, it can be good. Like this whole idea of shared suffering can be really good in group movements because everybody has that to look back on, and they can talk about it, and they can commiserate, and they can do it together, and they can support each other, and all of those things. So it's good. And there's always a beginning, a middle, and an end of this thing. And it starts with men of words. And so the men of words are the people, these are the people like, really it's people like Ray, right? And you, who you condemn the established social order, right? You say, look, the food pyramid is broken. The plate that we now use, is broken, right? You challenge those ideals, and you go out and you bang the drum and you preach the message, and you share all of this information, and you find fault with other people who are, who are preaching this, moderation and tolerance, and it's okay, use the food pyramid, it's right, and they don't think about why was the food pyramid developed or who is behind it or any of those kinds of things, right? Then come the fanatics, right? The fanatics come behind that, and the fanatics are there to break things. They take over the leadership from here. And so we've seen that like in veganism, we've seen it also in things like paleo and keto, right? The fanatics come and they start.
We watched it happen with fasting real time.
Right. Yeah. Fasting is a perfect example.
Watched it happen real time.
Right. And so, they both share, they both share great discontent, right? They are dissatisfied with the world the way it is. But, once the fanatic takes over, they're there to break things. They're there to make sure that everybody believes this thing no matter what. They're willing to make, grand displays of their power and authority. So inside of political movements, inside of bigger mass movements, these are people who are like the cult leaders. They're the people who are willing to, these are the terrorists that blow themselves up, to make a fanatical point. But after the fanatic, comes practical men of action. And practical men of action are the people who take over, and they go from this place. They try to bring a more calming, desirable effect for people, and to put a wrapper around this thing that people can manage, that they can accept, that makes it look good. They get rid of a lot of the dogma, but they reinforce the doctrine. And it's about steering the mass movement away from self-destructiveness, right? And it concerns itself with, people who are frustrated, and they're really looking at how do we move this from one place to the other where it can be continued in a meaningful way and grow. Because the fanatic can't help things grow. The fanatic can only point it out, and the people in the middle, the people who have always had this in their mind, think, yes, it's time. And when the systems break, then something has to be there to pick it up. And those are the practical men of action who pick it up and carry it on. And so it's that happens. When you look back at vegetarianism or veganism, or you look back at something like low carb, and you go clear back to when people started doing this, those first people were unsatisfied with the system. They were looking for a better way. And then people became like super fanatical about it. So, I would argue that Atkins was a fanatic around low carb. He was not a practical man of action. The people that took over Atkins and who are running Atkins now are the practical men of action.
Right.
They are the people they've taken it on and moved it forward. So I'm trying to put this into the terms of diet and food and those kind of things.
Yeah, it helps. Right. That's great.
And a juxtaposition on top of this, just to bring Hoffer back into this, is that whole section in True Believer, things which are not. And this that idea that we're less ready to die for what we have or are than for what we wish to have or to be. And this is where those people motivate to become part of this thing. And so creating that separation, when you were talking about, the food pyramid versus a food triangle, or creating these pillar points, which are foundational, so that you can say, the other side of it, so that if I am going to have this loss, it's really good to really be for this something. And we can see people do this with the environment or for animals or for whatever. It's like, I don't mind if these humans die of heart attacks eating fast food that's animal free, but I really don't want this animal to die. And it's a cognitive dissonance,
Are you telling me the Impossible Burger is not impossibly delicious?
We call them whatever burgers. So I do see a role for people who aren't really focused on health and they happen to have this belief about animals. That's fine. Where I see the contradiction is we put human flourishing as a big part of the health span solution. We put a big emphasis on humans doing very well. And so that would be a way that, I'm going to say the way that we're fanatic, meaning we want to move this beyond that to human flourishing. But my point here was this idea that people get involved in this thing of how it can be. And that's the thing they fight for. They don't really fight to keep things the same.
Right. But people are willing to defend their beliefs and ideas as irrational as they are, as hard as they can, and vehemently and violently and all of those things, because people are very strongly resistant to change because they're resistant to loss of comfort or identity or belief and all of those things.
Fear of loss is more motivating than desire to gain.
Absolutely. When my mom left the organization, and she finally did, she was constantly being pulled back towards it. So, 2 weeks before she died, I had a long conversation with her, and she's like, Dave, I really wonder sometimes if I didn't make the very worst decision of my life by leaving. And it was that would pull her back in. Like if she wouldn't have died a couple of weeks later, she would have definitely done another turn, in the barrel of that church.
Because it was fear. Was that just fear based?
It was fear, and it was comfort, and it was all these things. So my mom, the reason that she did this, I finally figured a lot of it out, but she was looking for salvation, and in this case, salvation for her very soul and for ours. And so, for her, the more rigorous the path and straight and narrow, the better the likelihood that we were going to turn out. And she knew she couldn't control. My mom had a lot of sense of not being in control of her life as she was, growing up, and as a woman who wasn't allowed to work outside of the home or do anything like that. She was out of control of a lot of things. And so she felt like this, this rigidity around this would give her a much more direct path. And then in the afterlife, you would be rewarded for your self-sacrifice and suffering and all of the things that were happening here. And, my mom struggled with her weight her whole life. That was the thing that she struggled with her whole life. And she also struggled with having an identity that wasn't, at one point she lost well over 100 pounds and was like in good shape. She'd had a heart surgery, and then she went on a very, it was a protein diet, that they do after people have heart surgery and things like that. She lost a tremendous amount of weight, but she couldn't recognize herself as a skinny person. And she couldn't recognize what that meant when people, would talk to her about, how she was when she was fat and things like that. And it was very difficult to, for her to ever assume that new identity. And so, but people will irrationally defend their decisions. So people often ask me, like, how could your mom, and if you had three children, this is a question I would, do you have children, Juliana?
I do.
You have one, at least? Okay. How many children do you have?
I have two. They're almost, in a couple months, they'll both be teenagers.
Okay, great. Perfect. So if you were in the ocean and your two children started drowning and you could only save one of them, which one would you choose?
Yeah, there's no answer to that question.
Right. There's no way to answer that possible. Well, there isn't. There actually is an answer. And this is how my mom made the decision that she did. You save the one you can. Mm. And so in my mom's case, she saved the two she could. So she let me go so that she could try and save my brothers. And that's that's the ultimate answer to all of this, right? So people, when they're faced with this kind of a choice, living or dying, people will try and save other people and they'll save who they can. But rarely will we say, I'll just save myself.
Yes. And that is, okay, this is what we've learned in all of our years of coaching people and counseling and me. I've been in the health and fitness industry for 25 years, and I have come to the conclusion, without doubt, like I've never seen it happen. I can actually say never, where someone wants someone else to make change and they don't. And then they haven't been able to successfully, have a transformation. Like, for instance, people that you care a lot about, like my parents, or like your kids, you want them to eat really healthy, and you see people with these circumstances that you can solve, or at least you can absolutely ameliorate the condition. And, for instance, I'll just be personally speaking, like with my father, I begged him, I've cried, I've yelled, I've, stuffed down tons of information. I've tried to inspire, like you've tried every single avenue, and it just never goes anywhere. And I watch him just spiraling down health-wise, and it's just so frustrating because I know that I could help him. And so like I wrote in the vegetarian diet, I said, you could lead a human to healthy, but you can't make them eat. So what you're saying right now is so resonant, because what it has to come from within. I can't even imagine. Persuasion. You've studied it. What do you say about that?
About people, their unwillingness to change themselves. It's their inability, quite often, to just get out of. People they're victims of their habits, and it's very difficult for them to think about changing, particularly the older you get. Right. So my grandmother's outlived all of her husbands but one, and she remarried a couple of times. And I remember one very specifically who, it's a great story and it's too long to tell here, but the short part of the story is he was 91 years old, and he wasn't feeling right, so he went to the doctor, and the doctor happened to be his son, who was a heart surgeon, and his son said, your aorta is 95% blocked. You need to immediately change your diet. You need to, start eating a plant-based diet. You need to cut all these things out. And his answer was very simple. I'm 91 years old. There's no way in hell I'm changing my diet.
Right.
I like fried chicken. I like mashed potatoes and gravy, and I like my eggs in the morning, and that's what I'm doing. And I don't care. Right. And he was like very articulate about it and honest. And so it's just like, that's how it's going to be. And he lived for another 3 years and literally died of a heart attack bending over to pick up flour for my grandma to fry chicken. And,
wow.
So like there's lots in that of like, just live your life and all kinds of things that way. But, he lived for 3 more years doing what he was doing. And you wonder, like, would he have had 7 or 10 or whatever, And so when we talk about health span and lifespan matching and all of those things, you have to kind of think through that. But in terms of people changing and in terms of people changing themselves, it really comes down to, we're much more willing to change other people than we are to do the work to change ourselves. It's much easier to be a critic than it is to be the actual doer of the thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so, when you talk about persuasion and you talk about doing that, you have to set up conditions that allow you. Number one, there has to be a desire to change, right? Yep. If there's no desire to change at all, right? And he had no desire to change.
Yeah, we begin with be a lighthouse, not a tugboat.
Right. And so if your desire to change isn't there, right? If you just don't care enough to do it, and you don't have something that's a meaningful enough cause to do it, you just won't, right? So for me, I look at things like my 16-year-old daughter and I say, well, I'm 55 years old. If I want to live long enough to see her grandchildren and be a meaningful part of their life, I need to live at least 30 more years, right?
Yeah.
And so, and to me, that's a powerful motivator. There's also lots of books I haven't read and lots of things that I want to do, right? And, plenty of sex I haven't had yet. So all of those things drive me towards saying I want to do better. And yet all of those things, while I'm in a better place than I've been in a long time, am I 100%? No, I'm not. And so, have I yo-yoed? I have, absolutely. And it always comes back down to those things and those habits that I haven't positively created for a long enough period of time, reinforced for a long enough period of time, that I've developed a new sense of normal. And once that new sense of normal is developed for people, then it's okay. When you realize bad is going to happen, in fact, more positive things could happen as a result of doing this. And, for me, like I've literally always and will till the day I die reject a label of vegan or vegetarian, right?
Even though you were basically eating vegetarian most of your life.
Well, not most of my life, but I mean a lot.
A large percentage of your life.
Yeah. I mean, like I grew up, I didn't even like meat when I was little. Like I didn't like it at all. And you still
like very more plain food. You're not a decadent kind of eater.
That kind of a thing. No, I'm much more like food is fuel, but I do find comfort in some kinds of food. So, like for example, like I know what my triggers are, and so
let's talk about donuts.
Yeah, right, exactly. So behind the Albertsons, when I was a kid, what was often there were like 3 or 4 day old donuts, right, and particularly maple bars.
Maple bars. I knew he was going to talk about them.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I know the story, and it's so real, and I think a lot of people will relate to this. This is a real teachable moment.
Yeah. So I mean, I lived for a lot of years in a caloric deficit, right? We just didn't have enough food. I can remember more than 1 year where 3 months out of the year, the only thing we had was beans and potatoes. So we had beans and potatoes every night for 3 months in a row. And, or if we could go and we could get free food behind the Albertsons, oftentimes it was stale bread, donuts, and milk, right? And so, and literally, I'm not kidding, you like strain the chunks out of the milk or don't, and that's what you did. And so for me, like a big giant trigger for me is Albertsons maple bars, right? So I see those things now, and it brings back so many emotional triggers for me, like overeat those things, like eat a dozen of them right now. Like these are the feelings and thoughts that go through my head today. I don't do it now, but even now, like I can occasionally have one, but the minute I take a bite of one, I realize what path I'm putting myself on. And oftentimes, like I'm not like binging and purging, but I'll oftentimes spit it out because it just reminds me too much. And I realize if I have 2 bites, it could be the last one,
right.
Before I eat a dozen or whatever. So I'll just do it, and so it's like that for me. So and that's it for so many people. That's why, rare and appropriate is important, but not until you're absolutely in control of rare and appropriate.
Well, we call that breaking the seal. Our client, Craig taught us that, and it's actually the most perfect explanation for it, because like once you have that first bite, it could be all over, I mean, I know that if I have one chip at the Mexican restaurant with salsa, it's all over for me, so I just don't have the first chip usually. And
another really good point on this, Dave, that's just so super important, that we say is, until the new diet is equally convenient, familiar, and enjoyable to the old one, you don't have a choice. One or more of those will dominate the plate. And then when you combine that with the concept that all food is habit, no matter how those habits were formed, could be a negative situation, could be a positive situation, but they're habits nonetheless. They keep motivating you, pushing forward. And then you combine that with our adaptive evolutionary strategy for a calorie scarce world called appetite that people want to define as broken. You're not broken. It's just you didn't have access to act on it. And you are living proof of that, because there were times in your life that food access was the prime issue. And during those times, you weren't overweight.
Oh, I was definitely not overweight. And the interesting thing about it is, though, when something like when you look at Maslow's hierarchy, right, that's one of the bottom of the pyramid kinds of deals.
Yep.
And it leaves a lifelong impact when you haven't had, when you know that there's a lack. Like I've had all of the I've had all of the arguments in my mind, like, I'm actually better suited if I'm a little overweight, because if I don't have any food, then I can last longer than everybody else. I'll be able to perform when other people can't. I'll be able to survive when other people can't, right? All of those kinds of things, which are really, really poor arguments in today's world.
Well, actually, I was just going to say, which we thought we were done with until now. And I think right now we're seeing people have that reaction to these potential food or these actual food shortages. And people are, I think that's part of this whole quarantine 15 where people are gaining weight and eating. And there's this whole survival mentality that's kind of kicking in that we haven't experienced in most of our lifetimes. So it's kind of interesting that we're kind of having this backward shift to something we thought we were done with.
Right. Absolutely. And people, so when you look at the things that people are doing, like learning how to bake or learning how to
garden.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Like people have sort of reverted to that. And they've also done the other thing is they reverted immediately to the things that are most comforting in a time of uncertainty. And it's carbs, and
we don't use the C word.
I know. But ultimately for most people, yeah, exactly.
Well, I don't care about most people. Our people, no, you're talking about starchy vegetables and...
No, you're talking about like baked goods.
That's exactly what they do, right?
Yeah.
And then they pile on starchy vegetables, and then they put gravy on top of it, and then they put salad dressing on top of that, right? And it's comfort food after comfort food, because it's what gives us a sense of certainty in an unsure world, because that's the habit that we developed over time, right? Mm-hmm. And so I totally agree with you. That's why people are gaining weight. But the other thing that happens too,
it's all the stuff they're putting on top of the starchy vegetables, not the starchy vegetables themselves.
No, I agree with that. No, I'm talking about carbs now. I'm just talking about the sense of going back.
So you said the C word again. Your profanity on our show.
You can talk about penises, but not carbs.
The F word and the P word. We don't want those, right?
Yeah, but it's comfort food, really.
Yes, I get it.
It's that whole idea of comfort food and how people how people think about it and how they use it. And
it's like self-soothing. Yeah.
It's completely self-soothing, and it's also completely acceptable. Like everybody, it's also a way of keeping track and keeping score, right? Look at how much beautiful bread I baked. Look how delicious my cinnamon rolls are. Look at this delicious thing that I made, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a way of, because the reality of it is, and we'll talk about this more, is that, for the biggest majority of people, me included now, like the bottom couple rungs of Maslow's hierarchy are well taken care of in westernized worlds. Most of us don't think about shelter, food, oxygen, those kind of things on a daily basis. Like it's just a given. You've got it. You're fine. That's not going to happen. So then we have to start thinking about, well, what else is hard? Oh, well, what's hard is making like really delicious, good looking food. That's why there's 50 chef shows on TV now and diners and dives and all these kinds of things, because everybody needs a 14-pound hamburger with 3 pounds of bacon and 17 pounds of different kinds of cheeses. And, and then you've got to make that at home and be able to demonstrate that you have this prowess and look what you're doing. And now your ultimate terms of survival are how well do I do, which is only grown more with Facebook and Instagram and those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. So, and we even call it, by the way, food porn. To just bring the whole thing back into the sex thing, we call it food porn.
Right. And we actively search it out, and we're looking for it, and we're trying to find more of it, and so when you look at that, though, like even in quarantine, people have to, they have to share their food porn. Look at this thing that I made. Look at this thing that I'm eating. My food was better than your food. It's more delicious. It's all of those things. Instead of thinking about, I don't know if this is factually true, so I'm going to preempt it with that, but I'll bet like I bet the searches for baking is probably 3 to 5x the searches for food preservation, dehydration, canning, those kind of things, right?
Right.
Nobody's thinking about that.
Plant prepping.
Plant prepping, right? Exactly. Yeah. Nobody. I mean, like that's a thing, obviously, in the prepper community. Like people have heirloom seeds and they do all those things, but they're not thinking about like how, okay, if this thing were to actually, like if this thing had been different than it has played out, right, and this thing lasted for a year. There's all kinds
of things. Bite
your tongue. Well, no, but I mean, like when I say a year, I mean, like, being quarantined and not having easy access to food and seeing more and more extreme versions of like supply chain disruptions and that kind of thing, right? Like canning and dehydration would be a very, very smart skill to learn. And while there is large access to food, a very smart thing to do.
Yes.
But that's not what people do, right? They think about like, how can I get my ho-hos? Like if there's a ho-ho shortage, it's going to get bad.
Right.
Like it's going to get really, really bad if I can't have my ding dongs.
Right.
Because You know, that's important stuff, right? I mean, like the fact that people are freaking out about bread, like that is simple, the simplest thing that anybody can make, right? Bread. People freak out because they can't get bread. Like, what's going to happen if you don't eat bread? But,
yeah, like even with snow, like it snows and bread, eggs, and milk go off the shelves as if I never eat any of those things, and yet it's just amazing to see it happen. Even when we were shopping in this situation, is that, and obviously Huntsville had a very different kind of world than say LA, but what was really amazing is when I was going into the store, there was no run on Brussels sprouts, right? There was no really run. There was a time when potatoes and onions got a little low, but we could always get them. But walking around the store, it's like one of the very first times I've actually been in the inside aisles of the store, except for the spice aisle and the bean aisle. I really don't go in any of those middle aisles. I go to the produce section and then, you know, I'm out, right? So, but what was really interesting is to see all the shelves that were empty, and it was almost all food I would really never eat.
Right. I mean, the meat was gone. The meat counters were empty. Like I've never seen that. Was really eerie. But then we saw like the plant-based meat sections were still there. Were kind of still full, which was kind of interesting. I
mean, this is Idaho, and you couldn't buy potatoes in a store.
Oh wow.
Like it was like that, you know. And so the smart thing to do, right? Like, I'll bet you didn't see a lot of people figuring out how to dig a root cellar either. You know, like those kind of things that people don't do. But we're irrational, and our willingness to continue to, you know, to go back to the things that give us safety and comfort and really not even safety, right? I mean, like there's probably going to be like a baby boom at the end of this. There's probably also going to be an increase in cardiovascular disease at the end of this because people just ate so much crap. Because it's so easy to do. And I'm not being critical of people because I've eaten my own share of crap.
Right.
And it's like there's things that you just do because it's convenient, because it's easy, because you are uncertain, and all of those things. So I'm not judging people for what they've done. I'm just saying that these are predictable things, though, right? They're all predictable. And when it comes to persuasion, when it comes to influence, you know, the idea, if you tell people like you should learn to can, people are like, yeah, that's too hard. You know, that's just too hard. I'd rather suffer and, you know, complain about not having food than actually doing something.
And this is really interesting because I don't know if you saw the news that ran just like 3 or 4 days ago, but farmers across Idaho were dumping potatoes due to lack of demands. There were piles of them, and it's just so incredible to think. And yeah, I would have to imagine that part of the potato being re-envisioned is the C word, right? I really believe there's a lot of people that really believe a potato is an unhealthy thing. And it blows me away. But then
why were shelves empty in the stores then?
Well, that was just a distribution thing. But starting from the beginning, they were not able to push out because so many potatoes get processed. And it is the French fry and the chip and all those kinds of other things that end up making the potato have a bad name, because it's not that. It's how it's all prepared that's the real problem. But so much of it's pushed through restaurants that it's a distribution channel thing. So the ones that make it to the grocery store are different than the ones that make it to all these other distributions. And with all these restaurants shutting down, you just had an excess amount of them. You can't get them because the supply chain gets broken.
Right, exactly. Like, and the funny part about it is, like, the Albertson stores in Boise they're not served from a warehouse in Boise. They're served from a central distribution point in Salt Lake City. And so all of that changes when when you have to start getting things to a distribution point, get it distributed back. I mean, there's like 1,000 things you could talk about that and why, you know, people should be sensible and thoughtful about things like this in the future. But it really comes down back to this idea. Like, I have a friend who, you know, was totally freaked out because she is she eats a keto diet, right? And she's like, what am I going to do? Like, how? There's no meat. I'm like, you understand there's if you can, you know, if you buy into that, there's many ways of keeping your body in ketosis, not the least of which is fasting, right? So, you know, like, just don't eat for a couple of days and you're probably good, if that's your whole deal, if that's your plan. And she's been very successful. She lost like 130 pounds, kept it off for 2 years. So I totally get why she is fanatical about her diet. But she was literally freaking out because she's like, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, you know, I just don't know what I'm going to do. I'm like, well, you can still get avocados. You know, those have fat in them, right? It's not the same. Okay, let's, but you can't, like, you just can't convince people that way. Like I could have become, like I used to. So here's what I did, truthfully. Like when I left the church, I used to go to churches on Sundays because I knew they had food and all that kind of stuff. And I would, and I could get money from them because I would talk about leaving this cult. I figured this out when I was fairly young.
Ooh.
But I was also, I was hustling, for sure. I was hustling, but I was also angry and had an agenda. And so I would go to churches and I would tell them, like, here's what happened. And you people are stupid. Like, what are you thinking sitting here in this pew, believing all this BS and doing what you're doing? Right? You people have lost your mind. So it was really great. Like they would pay me and give me the free meal, but they never invited me back for some reason, And so it took me a long time to like put those things together. I'm like, oh, right. Nobody wants to hear how stupid they are.
Right.
So it's, and I'm not saying anybody who's Christian is stupid. That's not the point. I'm making a facetious argument about this, but that was really my own miseducation at the time about how people think and change and all of those things. I don't really have a dog in a fight about anybody being any sort of thing they want to believe in. If they're not hurting people, like believe whatever you want. I don't really care.
Right.
So I want to go back to kind of my question because I really want your opinion in terms of being persuasive in terms of inspiring people. I mean, we say be a lighthouse, not a tugboat, but what are the most persuasive ways to inspire someone to make those changes?
So there's a couple of things, and the first one is find out, like, that was the whole point about like people not wanting to change themselves. What is desirable enough that would cause them to make change, right? What is so desirable to them that they would do it anyway, and build it around that, right? Keep the focus on that, not on the focus of you're going to get healthier, right? You'll lose weight and you'll look better. You'll do all of those things, right? That's not really the driver for most people. And there's also something else that gets overlooked in weight loss constantly, and it's the idea of grief. And so people don't realize that losing weight is a grief event, right? People lose their identity, right? They lose this way of being that they've had their whole life.
Yep.
They have to acknowledge that, the habits that they've built are not useful and in fact may have been completely wrong. They may have built these habits over a complete lifetime and they're completely wrong. And so people have to grieve. They have to grieve this way that they had been. And if they do, and they go through a proper grieving process, their chances of success go up dramatically. And so if you acknowledge to people that, and what is the first thing people, what's the first thing people do when you tell them that they should switch from a traditional American diet or a meat centric diet to a plant forward diet? What's the first thing they do?
Well, we don't tell people that. I stopped trying to encourage people because it's like an instant. I did it at the beginning. Let me say, when I first went vegan, 15 something years ago, and I wanted the world to know about what I had learned, and I tried to tell everyone, and I tried all sorts of different tactics. None of them were effective. And I really did, ostracized myself from a lot. I lost friends. My family was really upset with me. It was really disruptive of my life. And I realized that I had to stop. Like I had to just look, this is what I do. And I try to avoid talking about it now. I'm happy to help anyone learn about this. But I realized that me trying to inspire or tell or lecture or educate or like all the different kinds of tactics that you try to do or emotionally engage or scare, all of those different tactics were so ineffective. In fact, they were actually counterproductive.
Totally. So what is the thing though, even if you do it now, like what's the first part of the change that people have when you say, okay, there's another way, right? Maybe you could consider this.
Where are you going to get your protein?
Right. Which is a form of denial.
Right.
Yeah.
First step.
Right. Yeah.
Denial, anger, bargaining, depression.
All of those things,
acceptance.
Right? So if you look at Elaine Kubler-Ross's work on grief, and the stages that people go through, right? It's that whole idea. And the very first one is denial. And it's denial saying, look, if a plant-based diet was so good, we would have figured it out by now. It's not good for every single person. It's, so there's all of these denials. And then people go from that to being angry very quickly. They're either angry about the idea that they didn't know and that now they have to make this big change. Why didn't my parents tell me? Why didn't my teachers tell me? Why didn't the world tell me? Right.
Yep.
And so they get very, very angry. And then you're right. Then it goes to bargaining. Well, okay. So Ray, I'm losing weight, but like, I got to have birthday cake because my birthday's coming up in 90 days, so can I just do that? Would that be okay? And,
or in our case, you give somebody, say, 24 recipes for them, and they always need N+1.
Right.
Can I have this one more recipe? No, we're going to have these. They're not magic recipes, but it's always one more. And when you dig deeper and ask them, well, why is it that you need one more? Why are not 24 or not enough? Are 50 enough? Are 10 enough? So what's really amazing is the people will go, and clearly you can see this on the menus. I do agree that, differentiate or die, we did see an explosion of choice.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, when people go through a drive-through at a fast food restaurant, they typically get the same thing over and over. It's like when people ask me, well, don't you miss cheeseburgers? I said, I had enough cheeseburgers. I really don't need another cheeseburger in my life. I know what they're like. I know the experience. I don't need one. And that's why I don't need a whatever cheeseburger. I just don't need that experience. I actually get the same flavor profile in a bowl of what I call hamburger rice, black rice. I put some, our mayo on it. I put some ketchup, some mustard, some fresh diced onions, and some liquid smoke to give it that. And I eat a big bowl of rice, and I'm perfectly happy with that. Some Wickles relish. I'm perfectly happy with that. But you're right. They bargain. And that's why when we start, the clients that we do have, they all come to us. You can't click on something and become our client or find us. They all reach out. They all have a need that they're trying to fill. And what we tell them is, hey, it's at the end of the day, it's going to be eat less. The only thing we can provide you is unyielding accountability. That's the only thing we can sell.
Yeah, the rest of the stuff is in our books.
It's all there.
I mean, there's lots of pieces to this, though. Like, for example, like hamburgers are a really good example of that, right? And so when you look at vegan meat now, when you look whether it's made of soy or whatever they make it from, right? They make it look like the things that people are used to eating. And it gives them that, it immediately goes across and gives them that sense of comfort and
familiarity.
Exactly. This is something that I'm used to. It works. And so that's why you mean I can go to Burger King and get an Impossible Burger? I mean, like, seriously, look at that thing. That's probably, it's impossible not to die just as quickly as eating animals, if you ate that every day.
Right.
It's just, and again, I'm not judging people. I'm just saying.
No, I get it completely. And at the same time, what's really amazing is that as much as this grieving process is happening externally, there is also a grieving process that's happening as they're, at least with our clients, as they're going through. We had a psychologist that went through our program and a psychiatrist, and both of them made comments about this grieving process. They could see it very vividly. And it's
in themselves. Probably,
they could see it because you listen to what all the friends and family say, and it is an understatement to say that the biggest saboteurs to our clients are the people closest who care the most about them.
Yep.
They do the most cruel things you can ever imagine. It would never happen if they were going through, say, an alcoholism treatment, or if they were going through breast cancer therapy or brain cancer therapy. They would never say and do the things. Can you imagine someone going through chemo and your family not seeing you for a while, and you walk up and you say, "Oh my God, your hair's falling out. You look horrible."
Right.
And yet they do that when these people look actually perfectly normal. I mean, they're thinner now, but they don't look gaunt. They look like to a stranger, they look like a normal person. To their family, it's a huge change back to those habits, back to what they're used to seeing. So there is really this deeper grieving process that happens because everyone close to you is complicit in the game. They all have a vested interest in you not changing. Not only do you internally have a hard time changing and resisting this change, but everybody around you doesn't want you to change. They want you to be the big person that goes and eats all the great food with them at the restaurant. And you're like, "Hey, look, I'll go with you. I'm just not going to have that stuff." And yet it's just amazing to hear no one will say, "Hey, lay off the latte. You're getting an extra chin there. But all of them will say, oh my gosh, what are you doing? You know, you're getting way too gaunt. And it's like, I don't think they should comment either way, big or small, but they do.
Yeah, of course, they don't need to at all. But, you know, and there's so many other things biochemically that you could look at and say, look, there's lots of reasons that you're going to drink another latte. There's lots of reasons that literally are, I mean, the things that are outside of your control is what happens inside your body once you actually put the chemical in, right? Like those things are going to kick off and they're going to happen no matter what. And so that's one thing. But what all of that leads to is what caused my mom to fail over and over again was the depression, right? So out of that comes depression. When people say, people tell my mom, oh, you were so fun when you were heavy. Yep. My mom didn't change. Like she was still fun. She was still funny. She just didn't jiggle when she laughed. You know what I mean? But people they said such mean things to her. Like one of her most vivid memories that she shared over and over and over again was when she was 16 years old in high school. She was overweight, and like I've seen pictures of her, and she was overweight, but like not obese. And somebody stuck a hat pin in her butt to pop her.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, super mean. Like that's just bullying, right? It had nothing to do with food or being fat. It's just a bully being an ass.
Right.
But she connected those two things and could never disconnect them in her mind. And that was a huge challenge for her. And so no matter how skinny she got, she was always a fat person in a skinny person's body. She could always see it. She was always depressed about it. And that whole depression is where people fail in their diets, right? And this is where people who help people lose weight, get fit, you know, expand their health span, like they overlook this depression stage and they think that you can motivate people out of depression. If it were that easy, we would all just, you know, get up in the morning and say affirmations and, you know, read a couple of quotes from Jim Rohn or Tony Robbins or somebody like that. And we'd be like, okay, I'm on it now. I got it. Good. That's not how it works, though.
Yeah.
But that is the processing of the grief stage, right?
That's right.
And that is the part that people need to, that's where they need the most help.
Yeah. And
right?
moving on to that next level of the acceptance really requires that they come up with a new narrative. They have to displace these old narratives that were also arbitrary and made up, but maybe because of the situation in Albert's and the Maple bars, but it was arbitrary nonetheless. They have to find something that's equally as stimulating, equally as exhilarating, and something they own, and author their new narrative around that thing. And if they can be successful. And if they go back, like you were talking about with what I would call cheat days, where you say, okay, I'm just going to eat whatever I want once a week. That I just don't know that really works for that many people. Because there always will be somebody, right? Exception. So I'm not saying absolutes, but I am saying that I would say the vast majority of people, they do it. So, you know, a lot of my vegan friends often will say, you won't maintain this diet if you're not doing it for this reason, because of the strong bond with it being an ideology or emotion. And I do agree that is a strong reason to stay with it, but
that is a narrative. That is your narrative when you're vegan.
Right, exactly right.
Right.
It's like it's a driving story.
Right. But the other side, the other narratives that you can have that are just as strong, and part of why I guess I love coaching right now is because that too, I don't like being a hypocrite, and that too keeps me learning to love this new thing. I needed to find all these new amazing foods, and what I had for lunch today, which was black rice with kale, sake steamed kale out of our garden, with this big pile of this sriracha mushroom sauce on top of it. Dave, it was absolutely delicious. I mean, we eat things now that I would have never ever thought about eating before, and I can't say that I'm really missing out on anything. I was missing out on all this stuff then, but it's arbitrary. I do believe it's arbitrary.
The problem with it is, though, Ray,
yeah,
it doesn't look like a sandwich. It doesn't look like a turkey. It might taste really, really great, but everybody else is eating all this other fun stuff, and I'm stuck with kale.
No, because we make sandwiches and we make pizzas and we make all of that stuff too.
Yeah.
I totally get it. But what happens though is that's what people are doing. They're
in their mind, that's what they do.
Everybody else is doing, right. And that's that and that's why there's this vicious cycle of depression until people finally get over it and they're like, look, I've got this better way. And the only thing I would propose to you, Ray, is that narrative needs to come a lot sooner than before people get depressed, because it's what will pull them out of that depressive state much more quickly. Like if they start addressing the new narrative earlier.
We start with narratives from the very beginning. I mean, we start from day one with narratives. And what I'm saying is that the bridge from depression to acceptance is often sort of paved with that narrative. That is, they have to have something to look for. So, one of our amazing clients, Ryan, has this brand new pool in his backyard in this kitchen. And I said, hey, look, the very first time you start making steaks for your friends on that grill, it's all over. But if you create a whole new story, which is because he started 300 and something pounds and he's down, he's going to be at 170 something very soon, and he wants to be healthy. And the bottom line is that he has this new narrative now that my backyard is my health oasis. So, anybody can bring anything they want to make there. But as far as he's concerned, I only stay healthy in my backyard. And he's growing plants back there and he's swimming. Nice. He's doing all this great stuff. And had he had that first party and put those burgers on there and done the quote unquote rare and appropriate, it would have been a fast slide back to what he was doing before.
Absolutely. You've got to get into you've got to be at a different place before you go to rare and appropriate. Yeah. Right? You've got to be at a different place. But the thing out of depression is not really just that. It's also forgiveness, and it's forgiving yourself, the people, acknowledging all of those things. It's like accepting that this thing has happened. And, whether or not it was inside my control, I forgive myself for treating my body this way. I forgive myself for, the excuses I've made. I forgive myself for eating maple bars. Forgive whatever. Like, forgiveness is a big deal. Like really
we don't use guilt and shame in our program at all.
Well, but you don't need to. People do it to themselves. Yeah. And that's the reason that they have to forgive themselves. I would encourage everybody who is going to embark on any real sense of, like, I'm trying to transform my health, I'm trying to transform my weight, whatever it is, however you want to say those things, read the Grief Recovery Handbook by Russell Friedman first. Read that book and then go through the work in the book. You only need to do about the first 70 pages, but you should read the whole thing anyway and do all of the work. But if you'll do that work and you'll forgive yourself for these things, you will literally start losing weight for many, many reasons much more easily than you ever have, because you're forgiving yourself for a lot of the things that you've hung on to. But then going to that acceptance phase is, that's the part where then it begins to matter less, right? Like what other people do, how you judge and how you're judged, all of those things begin to matter a lot less because you've accepted who you are.
Right.
Now, there are all kinds of things that can cause you to change. And it's, one of the things that has been a challenge for me over a lot of years is, travel. So when I'm traveling 200 plus days a year, food in restaurants generally, even like I go to Montreal a lot. Montreal probably has more vegan restaurants than just about any place outside of Asia. And even going there, it's very difficult to eat properly, right? If you're
all restaurants are.
Well, right. And so it's very easy. So then if you're making bad choices, right, then what difference is one bad choice versus another? Yep. And then that's a very slippery downhill slope, right? It's just, then when you've done that for 3 weeks in a row, you've already started reconditioning an old habit that you had 30 or 40 or 50 years of practicing. And it's easier to destroy a new habit, even a positive, good new habit that you have a great narrative for, and go backwards to one that you had more practice in very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so you have to find those ways and, ways of making that work. But it's also very challenging when you're in, like in business situations and things like that, and you're doing meal after meal after meal after meal after meal with people, you're putting yourself in a dangerous place. And so I just had to start thinking about, how do I try, instead of going to meals with somebody, I'd rather do coffee. Like, let's do coffee instead of lunch.
Yeah, right? Go for a walk, or go, in the old, like we would tell people to go have a meeting, outside, mm-hmm. or, going to take a class together, or, there's so many other ways you can kind of socialize.
Right. Or just let's meet 30 minutes early. We can order food. I'm going to have to leave early, so I probably won't, and so then it's fine. Like, nobody asks you those questions.
Exactly.
But yeah, people have all of these weird little things, but all of these things, all of these triggers, all of these social pressures, all of this stuff is what causes people to fail if they haven't really forgiven themselves, gone through that depressive stage, found a new narrative, and, really had some practice at this new way of being.
Right. But, let's do one final thing as we bring this to a close. I want to really quick give people a sense of what's going on in marketing and in emotion when, pick your favorite group, whether it's it doesn't matter if it's advertising or media or politics or religions or whatever. What are people doing to persuade you, and how can you know? What are some of the tells that sort of thing is happening?
Well, I think what's playing out right now with coronavirus is a really good example. It's that the polarized people are already polarized along party lines. And, people who believe in science, people who don't believe in science, don't believe in science. And the zealots on either side of that argument are going to stay on either side of that argument. There's nothing you can do to pull them to the middle. There are people in the middle who don't understand science, but who have an open mind. And the challenge with it is, so this is one of the things I hear over and over again. How are these people always changing their mind? Well, they're getting better data every day, right. Or maybe not even better, maybe just different data, right? Mm-hmm. Let's just say it's different. It's not necessarily even better. But based on the data that they have to be able to make a different set of decisions. And so the problem with it is that people don't understand large numbers. They don't understand math generally. They don't understand, they don't understand what their biases are and all of those things. But people who are trying to push an agenda very well understand those. They hire people like me to help change people's minds or to be able to create opportunities for, change in their minds in whatever direction they want them to go. And people are very malleable that way. And so what's happening is that people take advantage of confusion and present what sounds like a really good idea. And the reality of it is, how you're being persuaded is when people are being highly dogmatic. How and I would say this. So I don't. Persuasion and manipulation are two sides of the same coin.
Right.
And they're all of the techniques that work to persuade people work to manipulate people too. The outcomes are slightly different or grossly different depending. But, my definition of persuasion is helping people come to their own conclusion, which happens to be one you share. And manipulation, interestingly enough, there's really only one thing that separates manipulation from persuasion, and it's intent. What are you intending to do? What is your outcome? Are you hoping to positively impact the world? And that's even a slippery slope, right? Because there are a lot of very dangerous people who think that they're positively impacting the world, right? Mm. But at the end of the day, you have to really look at it and say, is there a negative side to this? Like if everybody became plant-based, no meat eaters tomorrow, is there a negative side to that? And is that negative side really negative? Would it fundamentally shift the balance of power in the world? Would it fundamentally shift how, we organize ourselves? Would it kill massive numbers of people? Those kind of things when you're thinking about big change. But when you're thinking about small change and you're wondering about whether or not you're being manipulated, you have to just you have to start breaking the arguments down. You really do have to understand how to think rationally. You learn how to think critically. I recommend that everyone read a book which I know that you'll know this book instantly, Ray, because you knew the person who wrote it, but Demon Haunted World.
Yep.
By Carl Sagan. That book, and apply it to everything, regardless of whether it is, regardless of whether it's something big like religion or something small like, name your thing that people are dogmatic about, right? Mm-hmm. Ford versus Chevy. Any of those kinds of things, right? It's to ask harder questions. It's to really dig into what is the agenda that the person has? Why do they want me to do this thing? And is that useful to me? And if you start asking those kinds of questions, you'll be able to really start separating out very quickly what is meaningful and useful to you and whether you care. Because people say, you must be the hardest person in the world to persuade. I'm actually quite the opposite. I'm the easiest person in the world to persuade because I'm fascinated by the whole idea that people can be malleable and they can change. Oftentimes they just don't, though. And, so the other thing, if you look at change overall, when we think about this, right, you've got to really look at the elements of change. And it just when you look at the stages of grief, the elements of change are also very, very important, right? There's pre-contemplation, there's contemplation, there's preparation, there's action, there's maintenance, and there's relapse, right? Mm. And what happens is, like, this, I see this over and over again with people who are focused on helping people change their eating. Like, the relapse part is where the guilt and shame and all of those things come into, instead of a healthy exploration of what happened. Mm-hmm. Like, let's really dig into that. Like, okay, I get it. Okay, that happened, right? It's not like you started taking heroin again. I mean, it could be as dangerous, but it's not like that, right? But you relapsed, something happened. Let's deconstruct what happened. Let's use our critical minds and find out what happened. And let's see if we can set up some condition so that it doesn't happen again in that way.
Yep.
And let's see if we can do that. But instead, what happens is, people relapse, and then they start shaming themselves, and they start, shooting themselves and doing all those kinds of things. And so then, well, I've already relapsed. I might as well eat 6 hamburgers instead of 2, or a dozen maple bars in my cases, right? Or in my case. And so then they never get to that part about, like, what could I have done differently? How can I do it differently? And the thing that I've loved about, and granted, I don't know as much about Juliana's frame as I do yours, Ray, but it's like, look, here's the deal. It's not, I fell off the wagon and I ate one really crappy meal, or I, had the KFC or whatever it was, right? It's not, okay, so that happened. It doesn't mean that you have to do that for another 2 or 3 days. It just means, okay, that happened. Now go back to what you know to do.
Yeah, in this bite is what we teach.
Yeah.
Because when you find yourself talking about what you did last week or what you're doing next week or starting Monday, what you're doing is avoiding dealing with the next bite that's coming on the end of your fork. And if you focus on in this bite, what you really realize is an hour after you eat, it doesn't matter what you ate.
Exactly. Exactly right. The same is true of persuasion, right? So it's that very same thing, right? It's like, okay, look, if you get persuaded and you start going down a path that you now disagree with, like, that's the fundamental right of every human being, is to say, I don't want to do that anymore.
Right.
Like, I'm done doing that thing and I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm going to do something different, or I'm going to test something different. How many hypotheses in your life, Ray, have proven to be completely wrong?
Yeah, many, many, many. And you know that about me, which is really great, because you've seen me go through these processes and coming back to.
But what happened though, because your hypothesis was wrong? I mean, you're still here talking.
See, well, for me, what was really great is that I cherish being wrong, because most of the time when we learn, it is from being wrong. If you're observing the world and you see it in a certain way, normally it's when there's contradictions, it's an interpretation issue. It's never, the world doesn't have contradictions. The world just is. And that's one of the most powerful messages that came, for example, just back to Carl Sagan. He said that we arranged a global civilization in which the most crucial elements profoundly depend on science and technology. And we've also arranged things so that almost no one understands science and technology. And this is so important today in this situation. This is a prescription for disaster. We might get it for a while, but sooner or later, this combustible mixture of ignorance and power is going to blow up in our faces. And I've thought about that so many times over the last few month or two, that is exactly the kind of thing that he saw back in 1996. He saw it happening. He saw it coming. And I think a lot of people, I really believe it is something that's critical. But yes, back to the hypotheses. To me, I don't personalize them. I want to understand how the world works. I have an insatiable curiosity, and I love when I'm wrong. Juliana's seen certain times when I was so dug in on a thing and I got new data, and she watched me just
instantly
flip on a dime, and completely embrace it. And she's like, well, you didn't even, like, there wasn't even any fun in that because I got new information. What do I care?
Right. I mean, I literally have lost relationships over that whole idea. Like, somebody would say, I don't even know what you believe anymore. Like, 2 years ago, you said this thing. I'm like, oh my God, you mean like I was supposed to be fixed in that belief the rest of my life because I put it out for a moment? Right. But that's what you said though about ignorance and science, Ray, is very, very true. Number one, like, people don't understand science well enough. And the
world depends on it. This is Sagan's world.
It does. And at the same time, right, it's also like in the face of what is unknown, right? You have to use science to figure out what can be known so that you can then ultimately make good decisions. And in the process of understanding what can be known, you're going to make a lot of wrong decisions and a lot of wrong missteps. But the second part of what you said is power. And, that's the question around an event like this you have to really ask is like, who is trying to gain what power from making what to most people are really obviously bad decisions. But that could, when it comes to the economy and those kinds of things. But it's, when you look at that, you could apply that very same thing when you talk about power and you talk about ignorance, to food. You can apply it to religion.
Relationships.
To relationships. You can apply it to education. You can apply it to anything. Those two things are sort of universals in that sense of understanding why anybody makes any attempt to do something and how they are successful in making that attempt. And when something's as complicated as science, it's very easy to then insert a soundbite that is believable and repeatable over something that is not really understandable to the masses, right? You have a completely different relationship with science and math than I do. And so it's easy for me to hear something and say, wow, that sounds really right. That makes a lot of really good sense what that person just said. But I don't really even have the context for it. I only have the emotion for it. And because my emotions have overcome my ability to understand something and my need for reason and rationality and, assurance and all of those things like overcome it. And when you think about food, it's the same thing. So when somebody says, a plant-forward diet or vegetarianism or veganism is better, and then they give you like these really good, easy to remember and think about things, that's really great. But then the keto people do the same thing, right? And that's that whole game that plays out every day across everything. And the question you have to ask, including of you two, is what do you have to gain from this? And, and me too, for that reason, like, what do I have to gain from being on your podcast? I mean, you have to ask that question all of the time.
Well, I'm going to give them that answer because I want I want you to plug the books that you've got out there, your website, how they contact you. I want it to be a 100% promo. Everybody can't guess. I love the stuff Dave's written, and I think you guys will too.
Yeah. So I'm just diving in right now, and I'm loving it.
Tell everybody how they contact you and some of the books.
If you want to read any of my books, you can you can just Google me. It's Dave Lakhani, Lakhani. You can Google me on the Google, and you will find lots of videos and all kinds of things that I've done over time. You can go to Amazon and you can find my books on Amazon: Persuasion, The Art of Getting What You Want, Subliminal Persuasion, How to Sell When Nobody's Buying. And if you're really interested in like looking about how you would apply this to your business and that kind of thing, you can go to growthfoundrydigital.com, and that's my digital marketing agency where we work with people to help them build influential brands, cult followings of consumers in a very ethical and positive way.
Well, that is all fantastic. It's so exciting to have you on and exciting to be going. Really, at this time, it's a perfect time to hear this kind of message. And everybody's going to have to make those judgments the best they can with the information they have. But you'll certainly arm them to make a better decision.
Yeah, I mean, if I, in my altruistic view of myself and what I'm hoping to give to the world, I'm hopeful that I will help people become better thinkers, better questioners, and better observers of what's going on around them, and of asking better questions about why.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here today, Dave. Can't wait to visit you in Boise again and hang out a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliana. It was wonderful to spend some time with you today, and I'm really looking forward to diving more into what you've been doing and all of that. I haven't known you as long as I've known Ray, but I'm certain that I've already read your new book, and I'm looking forward to just learning more. So thanks very much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thanks, Dave.
Take care.
We want to persuade you to eat well.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us on this leafy green path to good health.
It's always the food, so remember,
keep eating right.
Thank you for listening to Science and Saucery. For more details about the content in today's show or to contact Juliana and Ray, please visit us at healthspansolution.com.
Welcome